Number 1.
On December 17, 1967, the skeletal remains of a young male were discovered in a wooded area in Balsam Lake Provincial Park, located near Hovey, Ontario, Canada. His hands and wrist bones were knotted together by twine, and there was no clothing at the scene, except for a pair of tennis shoes. On May 15, 1968, the skeletal remains of another young male were discovered in a field near the village of Schaumburg, Ontario. The victim's hands were tied behind his back with a shoelace, and once again, there was no clothing at the scene. Even though both victims were found 130 kilometers apart, the similarities between the two scenes suggested they were murdered by the same killer. Neither victim could be identified for until clay busts were made of their heads and displayed on television during a press conference by the Ontario Provincial Police in November 2006. Almost immediately, the op were contacted by viewers who thought they recognized the Schaumburg John Doe as Richard Dickie Hovey, a 17-year-old guitar player from Fredericton, New Brunswick who vanished in 1967 after traveling to Toronto's Yorkville district to pursue a music career. DNA testing conclusively identified the victim as Dickie. In February 2009, the clay bust of the Balsam Lake John Doe's head was displayed on a TV show and recognized by a viewer who thought he might be her missing 18-year-old brother Eric Jones, who had also vanished in 1967 after leaving his hometown of Noëlville, Ontario to travel to Toronto. Once again, DNA testing conclusively identified the John Doe as Eric. The last known sighting of Dickie Hovey occurred in Yorkville in June 1967, when he was seen climbing into a light blue Corvair driven by a muscular black man. The driver matches the description of James Henry Greenidge, a sexual predator who is believed to be Canada's first serial killer. On two separate occasions in 1967, Greenidge picked up two young gay men in Toronto before driving them out into a remote area to sexually assault and violently attack them before stealing their clothing, tying them up, and leaving them for dead. Greenidge was caught when one of the victims survived the attack and identified him. After serving 10 years in prison for these crimes, Greenidge changed his name to James Gordon Henry, but was arrested again for murdering a prostitute in Vancouver in 1981. This time, Greenidge Henry received a life sentence. He is currently 80 years old and incarcerated in a British Columbia prison. He is also considered a possible suspect in the death of an unidentified male whose skeletal remains were discovered in a wooded area near Markham, Ontario in 1980. Since women's clothing was found at the scene, it's believed that the victim was either transgender or a cross-dresser. Due to the similarities between Greenidge's two 1967 attacks and the deaths of Dickie Hovey and Eric Jones, he is considered the prime suspect, but no conclusive evidence has ever linked him to the two murders, which officially remain unsolved.
Number 2.
They called her Piglet, on account of her upturned nose and her small frame, and the little pig tattoo above her left breast. Her real name was Peggy Sue Houser, but she didn't mind the nickname. Besides, if she was feeling mean she could back a boy up, a 100-pound Irish and Cherokee whirlwind of knuckles. She did it to her brothers when they crossed her. She even earned a brown belt in karate. This night, June 14, 1981, she wasn't looking to fight. When an argument broke out in a little bar on South MacDill called the B-52, Piglet, a few months shy of 19, decided to split, leaving behind her girlfriends. She didn't need more trouble. She walked across the parking lot and tore the two-lane and thumbed the dark. She didn't come home that night or the next. Her disappearance didn't even make the papers. She missed Thanksgiving and Christmas. Months turned to years, years to decades. Her sister held out hope that Peggy Sue would show up one day with a husband and a bunch of babies. Her mother never changed the message on her machine. "Peggy, no matter where you're at, leave a message, and I will come right away." But she never called, and her mother fell ill, and just before she died she relayed one final request. "If you ever find Peggy Sue, bury her beside me." Aaron Kimmerl was working late one Friday night in May, touching up a website for the Tampa Bay Cold Case Project, which she helped launch. As a forensic anthropologist and assistant professor at the University of South Florida, she and her students work with law enforcement and medical examiners to identify remains and reanalyze cold cases. Across Florida, more than 500 individuals who either died alone or were found in public places remain unidentified. In the Tampa Bay area, there are nearly 80 such cases. Since 2006, Kimmerl and her colleagues and students have worked more than 90 cases. They've helped authorities find and identify remains and determine cause of death. They've also helped with facial reconstructions in hopes of matching remains with missing persons. One case caught Kimmerl's attention, a Jane Doe known as Me82000013. As she prioritized cases, Kimmerl felt she had a good shot at identifying this one. The remains had been found on January 3, 1982, on W. Sly Avenue, not far from Lido High School. They belonged to a young female, 14 to 20 years old. She'd been found naked, without any clue who she was. She appeared to have been killed and dumped in the woods. Over the years, authorities had tried periodically to identify the unknown girl by comparing her teeth to the dental records of missing persons, but they'd never made a match. Kimmerl had reanalyzed the remains and created a new biological profile of Me82000013 for the website. Kimmerl emailed the Work in Progress website to some colleagues for feedback. One of them, a woman familiar with the Doe Network, a database of missing persons, responded with a tip. "Look at this one," came the reply. The woman suggested there were several similarities between the Me82000013 remains and Peggy Sue Houser, who had disappeared from Tampa just 7 months before the remains were found. Authorities compared the dental records of more than 20 missing women, including Peggy Sue Houser, to Me82000013, but none matched. The approximate age was correct. The timeline was consistent, and the remains were found about 10 miles from where Houser was last seen. But several things didn't add up. First, Peggy Sue Houser's mother had told police that she got a phone call from her daughter a few weeks after she was reported missing. Hattie Oglesby, who lived in Piqua, Ohio, told police that Peggy Sue called and asked if she could come home. When Oglesby said yes, the phone went dead. She believed it had been a local call, so she drove to a nearby gas station and showed the attendant a photo of her daughter. The attendant said he had seen Peggy Sue with a man on a motorcycle. Because of the new information, the case was transferred to authorities in Ohio. Police there exhausted their leads. Second, Peggy Sue's dental records, provided by her mother, didn't match the Jane Doe records. It appeared on paper that the Jane Doe had more teeth than Peggy Sue. But Kimmerl knew dental records were often unreliable. Peggy Sue's records were from age 12, and during adolescence permanent teeth continue to erupt. The map of one's mouth continues to change as teeth are lost or fixed. Often, dental x-rays aren't available to compare to unidentified remains, so comparisons are made with dental coding, a series of numbers assigned to each tooth that comprises a kind of numerical sketch of one's teeth. But often, untrained personnel fill out forms and enter errors into databases. Kimmerl needed more. On that Sunday in May, she drove to the Hillsborough County Medical Examiner's office to review the file for Me82000013. The following day, she told Amanda Whitten, the manager of investigations for the examiner's office, of her suspicions. "I think the dentals are wrong," she said. "I don't think Peggy Houser should have been excluded." Kimmerl and Whitten walked into a storage cooler at the examiner's office and pulled out a clear Rubbermaid bin containing the remains of Me82000013. They assembled the skeleton on a metal autopsy table and scanned it for trauma. Peggy Sue had broken her wrist when she was young. They couldn't see the fracture. But then Kimmerl superimposed a transparent photograph of Peggy Sue on an image of the skull. The two seemed to match, especially the position of the eyes and the diastema, the gap between the two front teeth. She had enough to ask for a DNA comparison. Whiddon phoned Eric Houston, a cold case detective with the Tampa Police Department. Houston tracked down Peggy Sue Houser's father, Steve, and sister, Sandra Preeser. He swabbed their mouths and sent the samples to the FBI for comparison to Me82000013. In August, the FBI wrote to Houston, saying the mitochondrial DNA showed Houser could not be excluded from being the murder victim. He then submitted the DNA again for nuclear testing. On November 14th, he received confirmation that the DNA from the remains was a perfect match to the DNA of Peggy Sue Houser. Sandra Preeser was at work at the Colonnade restaurant when she got a phone call. She held the phone down and looked at her manager. "I think they found my sister," she said. 30 years is a long time to wonder. She and her siblings remember the wild little girl forever stuck in 1981. They remember how she loved to listen to Journey and Rio Speedwagon, how they'd all go down to the old fairgrounds and lay out blankets to hear Joe Cocker, how Piglet would join in the kickball and basketball games on the street in the old neighborhood. Every once in a while, we'd bump into somebody and they'd ask about her, said her brother, Steve, 53, a carpenter. I always knew something happened to her, but I never stopped wondering. That's what keeps Kimmerl and Whiddon going. There's a great need for this work, Kimmerl said. And it works. All that effort pays off. It's important to the families, Whiddon said. I can't imagine not knowing where my child is. Now that the remains have been named, the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office will investigate the homicide. Houston said police have received a few tips through the years, but no solid leads. The disappearance hurt Peggy Sue's mother, Oglesby, the most. It took 3 years of counseling before she could leave the house. She kept rejection letters from Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted. She looked for her youngest child until her death. Now that we've found her, we are going to bury her next to my mom, said Preeser. That was her last request for my sister to be with her. After the holidays, they'll all fly to Ohio and put Peggy Sue Houser in the ground by her mother, where she belongs. Ben Montgomery can be reached at 727-893-8650.
Number 3.
From the day in 1996 when Pedham discovered the humble grave marker etched with the words Jane Doe. April 1954. Age about 20 years, she has spent nearly 14 years investigating the crime. She scoured newspaper archives, court and coroner records and genealogy sites in hopes of identifying the mystery woman and bringing her murderer to justice. In the process, she has evolved from a middle-aged mom with zero police training into a lauded cold case investigator called upon by law enforcement agents nationwide. In May, her work paid off when the victim's surviving family members joined her at the cemetery to replace the Jane Doe headstone with one bearing the woman's true name, Dorothy Gay Howard. Now, with the mystery solved and her book Someone's Daughter, In Search of Justice for Jane Doe, Taylor Trade Publishing, nominated for a Colorado Book Award, the biggest question facing Pedham is, what's next? At the age of 63, I have found my life's work, she says. Pedham was born in 1947 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the only child of an electrical engineer and a homemaker who didn't like housework. She grew up in the suburbs in an ultramodern home she hated. I never felt comfortable there, she says, tracing her affinity for all things antique back to her early youth. When she landed in Boulder in 1965 as a CU psychology major, she found herself drawn to the area's historic buildings, rugged mountain towns, and rich pioneer history. Rather than observe them from a distance, she immersed herself, moving into a tiny Thermal Canyon cabin with no electricity or running water where she cooked on a wood stove, sewed quilts, and raised 2 daughters. Living up there in that environment really got me interested in who came before me, she recalls. Since then, she's written a dozen local history books, including Separate Lives, The Story of Mary Rippon, Bookload, and Behind the Badge, 125 Years of the Boulder Police Department, Bookload, as well as countless history columns for the Boulder Camera. But on October 5, 1996, her relatively ordinary life took an unexpected twist. While playing the part of Mary Rippon during a Meet the Spirits event at Columbia Cemetery, Pedham listened intently as an actor playing Jane Doe told Doe's story. Please give me back my name. No one knows who I am or how I came to die battered, beaten and naked on the rocky edge of Boulder Creek. I was found in April 1954 by two college students out on a hike. My murderer, whoever he was brutal and vicious, but the people of Boulder gave me a Christian funeral. My first thought was that could be my daughter, recalls Pedham, whose daughters were 19 and 23 at the time. I thought to myself, no one should go to the grave without a name. In the coming years, Pedham managed to track down the woman's missing autopsy report and photos, and reconstruct much of what happened to her via brittle newspaper clippings, phone interviews, and internet research. She enrolled in a 12-week Citizens Academy to learn about the inner workings of the criminal justice system and sit in on police officer training classes. And she regularly visited the rocky Boulder Creek shore just 300 yards downstream from the Boulder Falls parking lot where Jane Doe's body was found. In 2003, with a bulging file in hand, she knocked on the office doors of Boulder County Sheriff Joe Pell and then Lieutenant Phil West to ask if they would be willing to exhume Jane Doe's body and reopen the case. They obliged, well aware of the daunting task ahead. Frankly, for that period of time, our files are non-existent. There is a big blank in documentation through the 1960s, West says. It was only through Sylvia's diligence that we were able to reconstruct what became the case file. Pedham proceeded to open a donation fund and raised several $1,000s from interested Boulder citizens and beyond to help pay for the exhumation. She also enlisted the help of Vidic Society members, forensic specialists who volunteered to help solve cold murder cases, who donated their time and expertise over the years. On a foggy June morning in 2004, a backhoe scraped away the dirt in Columbia Cemetery to reveal a disintegrated coffin and the exposed remains of Jane Doe. As officers wrapped police tape around the scene, Pedham found herself on the inside of the tape, standing by the open grave looking in. It was exhilarating, she admits. A forensic sculptor used Jane Doe's remains to craft a 3D image of what she looked like, and soon it was appearing everywhere from People magazine to America's Most Wanted. Finally, after several heartbreaking false leads and years of wondering, Pedham got her answer on October 23, 2009. DNA tests had confirmed that Jane Doe was Dorothy Gay Howard, a strong-willed Phoenix teen who left home in 1953, possibly to visit an aunt who lived in Denver's Capitol Hill area. She never arrived. While the case remains open, Pedham and West suspect Howard encountered convicted serial killer Harvey Glattman in Denver. Ligature marks shown in Doe's morgue photographs are similar to those left on the three women Glattman was convicted of murdering. He was executed in 1959. On May 22, Howard's surviving sister, Marlene Ashman of Polk County, Arkansas, traveled to Boulder to bid final farewell to her sister and provide her with a tombstone etched with her name. At least people here were kind enough to love her and give her some dignity, Ashman told reporters. Standing by that gravestone today, Pedham can't help but feel a sense of melancholy. Her relationship with Howard's family has been more distant than she had hoped for. From the day I first walked into the sheriff's office and said I want to return these remains to the family, I looked forward to the day I would meet them, she says. But it hasn't been a warm relationship. Maybe it's just too soon. And after so many years of dogged pursuit, it has left a big gap in my life now that it's solved. But that void will likely soon fill. Already Pedham has been credited with assisting in another Boulder County cold case, helping to locate the killer, now deceased, in the 1970 homicide of an 18-year-old named Harold Nicky Nicholson. She's also teaching courses to local law enforcement agencies, writing for forensic magazines, and juggling invitations from around the country to help in unsolved crimes. I may have found my next project, she says, keeping mum about the details. And this one, she quips, won't take 14 years.
Number 4.
Gail was twice divorced and the mother of 2 teenage boys. She looked for companionship in the personal ads of her local newspaper. When she placed the ads, she described herself exuberantly: unique female, 34, attractive, trim, intelligent, affectionate, independent, slightly crazy night owl. Likes music, movies, dance, dining. Seeks a seagoing, intelligent, responsible, not overweight male for growing relationship. I'm in Wiscasset. Where are you? On June 21, 1986, Gail drove alone to a restaurant in Brunswick, Maine, to meet a blind date. Her family never saw or heard from her again. Despite the tone of her personal ads, Gail was shy and withdrawn. For her, placing these ads was an act of courage. It was also an act of hope. The last entry in her diary read, "It would be nice to find someone to date over the summer. Who knows, maybe I'll get lucky and find someone interesting." Gail was searching not only for companionship, but also for a father figure for her two boys. Her desperate need to find love placed her in the center of an unsolved mystery. According to Gail's sons, on Friday evening, June 20, 1986, she had a 2.5-hour telephone conversation with a man named John. They assumed that she had met him through the personal ads. The next morning, she told her sons she planned to have coffee with John at the Howard Johnsons in Brunswick. If things went well, she planned to spend the afternoon with him. That night, Gail's 13-year-old son, Ryan, returned home from a friend's house. He discovered that Gail was not home. He was concerned, but not alarmed. When she did not return home the next night, her family called the police. By that point, it had been 37 hours from the time she had left home to meet her date. Police immediately searched the Howard Johnson's parking lot and located her car, a 1980 Toyota Tercel. At that point, there was no indication of foul play. They considered it a case of an adult woman who had gone out and spent the night. They learned that it was not unusual for her to spend the night out. However, it was unusual for her to do it without calling her family. Gail's father, Platt Monfort, knew something was wrong because she always let her children know where she was. Her family was forced to wait until 11 a.m. Monday morning to have her officially declared a missing person. Only then could the police search her car. Her family hoped that she had left a note behind explaining her whereabouts and naming the person she had gone on a date with. However, nothing of importance was found in the car. Gail's mother, Betty Monfort, said that Gail would normally tell her the first and last name of the person she was going on a date with, along with where he was from. However, on this particular occasion, she did not give her that information. Betty spoke to her earlier that afternoon. She said that she had a feeling that she was going to have a date and that she was going to be happy and have fun that weekend. It turned out to be the last time Betty spoke to her. 2 hours after the police had removed Gail's car, a Howard Johnson's busboy made a startling discovery, a set of keys in the parking spot where her car had been parked. Betty identified the keys as belonging to Gail. According to her, Gail never went anywhere without those keys. She said that they would have had to hurt or kill her to get her away from those keys. She knew that something bad had happened to Gail. 2 weeks later, a 9-year-old boy playing on the other side of the Howard Johnsons made a second startling discovery, Gail's purse. After the purse was discovered, detectives began to suspect that foul play was involved in Gail's disappearance. Betty said that Gail never would have been separated from her purse unless someone attacked her and dragged her away. Detectives examined her purse and noticed that it was neat and orderly inside. It appeared that it had not been rifled through by anyone looking for money or valuables. Curiously, while the purse appeared untouched, there was no money in it. Even the emergency $5 bill that Gail always kept tucked in a secret compartment was missing. Using a date book they found in Gail's purse, detectives compiled a list of the men that she might have dated in the last year. One of them was a man named John from Old Orchard Beach. This man swore he had never dated Gail. He said the only time he might have talked to her on the phone was months before she disappeared. He had a rock-solid alibi for the day she vanished. So did all the other men the police questioned. The police were totally baffled. Gail kept detailed records of the men who responded to her ads, yet there was no record of a man named John in her files, who had called her and talked for 2.5 hours the night before she disappeared. Why were her keys found in exactly the spot where her car had been parked? Why was her purse found on the other side of the restaurant, apparently untouched, but with no money in it? Were the keys and purse thrown where they lay by someone who attacked her? Or is it possible she placed them there herself? A new theory about Gail's disappearance emerged when police interviewed Kristen Roy, a local late-night disc jockey. He said that Gail would often call sometime after 1 a.m. just to talk and go on in general about life experiences. Finally, one day, she asked if he would like to meet her. According to him, she always seemed to be very sad or depressed, almost to the point of not being able to move. He always felt that she was going to one day give up and cease to exist. For years, Gail had struggled with depression and had been on medication for it. Several times, she had considered taking her own life and talked about it with her sister, Susan Montfort. Her family reluctantly considered whether her disappearance might have been a suicide. It was noted that she was unemployed, living on welfare, and her trailer had been destroyed by a fire 2 years before she vanished. However, Susan does not believe that Gail committed suicide. She does not believe that Gail would have left her family and let them go through the pain and uncertainty that they have went through. She believes that Gail is out there, someone possibly suffering from amnesia. With the help of truck drivers, Gail's family distributed missing posters throughout the eastern United States. On Friday, August 14, 1987, over a year after she disappeared, truck driver John Scott of Swansea, South Carolina, spotted her missing poster in a Georgia truck stop and called the police. He recognized her as someone he had given a ride to several months earlier. John said that he was with the woman for about 24 hours. She did not talk very much. He said that when she did talk, she spoke with a northern accent. He recalled that she was dressed very neat, unlike the hitchhikers he would normally pick up. Detectives asked him if he noticed if she was on any medication. He said that he did notice some pill bottles in her purse. However, he did not know what was in them. They next asked him how sure he felt that the woman was Gail. He said that he would bet money on it. John's story suggested another possibility, that Gail had engineered her own disappearance from the Brunswick restaurant. Detectives suspected that she could have told her sons a fake story about going on a date, gone to the restaurant, parked her car, either concealed the keys under the car, or tossed them under it, thrown the purse in the bushes, and then caught a ride with somebody leaving the restaurant area, or a truck driver leaving the area. Kristen, however, does not believe that Gail had it together enough, or was brave enough, or sure of herself enough to just pack it up and head for another part of the country without telling anyone what she was doing. He said that her family could not even get her out to go for a Sunday drive, or get ice cream, or go to a restaurant. Betty believes that it is possible Gail may have voluntarily left, but she fears that she is wandering somewhere, unaware of her identity and needing help. Betty said that she wants Gail to know that if she is well and happy, she does not have to come home. They just want to know that she is alive and safe. Her family is no closer to the truth than they were on the day she disappeared. Was she the victim of foul play? Or is she wandering somewhere, unaware of her own identity? Or could the blind date with John merely have been an elaborate ruse she concocted to cover up her own disappearance? In Gail's diary, she wrote, "The only thing I want is to find a man to share my life. I know I'm lonely and tired of doing it all by myself. Time is becoming a big enemy to me. To say it passes slowly is a laugh. For me it seems to stand still." When truck driver John Scott last saw the woman he thinks is Gail, she was headed for Abilene, Texas, along U.S. Route 20. Suspects the man named John, whom Gail was supposed to go on a date with, is considered a possible suspect, but he remains unidentified. Police questioned several men who were in her date book, but all were ruled out. This case first aired on the October 5, 1988 episode. It was updated on the November 16, 1988 episode. It was submitted to the show by Gail's family. Some sources state that Gail was from Westport Island, while others state that she was from Wiscasset. Some sources incorrectly state that Gail was 34 or 36 when she disappeared. The 2.5-year search for Gail came to an end in Mobile, Alabama. Tragically, it was discovered that she took her own life shortly after she disappeared. Chuck Elliott, a forensic administrator in Mobile, watched the broadcast and recognized her as a woman who had died in a local hotel room in 1986. When he saw her photograph, he immediately saw the resemblance between her and the unidentified woman that they had in their laboratory in Mobile. After 2 weeks of forensic tests, which included a comparison of dental records, a positive identification was made. Police now theorize that Gail orchestrated her own disappearance. They believe that, after she drove to the restaurant, she hid her keys somewhere on her car, removed all the money from her purse, discarded it, and then flew to Alabama. That evening, between 10 and 11 p.m., she checked into the Hilton Hotel in Mobile, where she registered under the name Jackie Stafford of San Diego, and paid for 2 nights. 3 days later, police discovered her body. She had died of a drug overdose. A bag of prescription drugs found in the room matched those prescribed for Gail, some of them for depression. On November 11, 1988, Gail's family held a memorial service for her in Brunswick, Maine. On June 8, 2005, Gail's father Platt passed away at the age of 84. Tragically, in September 2021, Gail's son Tim committed suicide at the age of 52.
Number 5.
Days after the Titanic hit an iceberg, a Canadian morgue ship was dispatched to the North Atlantic, where sailors were confronted with a grisly sight. Hundreds of frozen bodies floating on the cold, choppy waters. Among the dead was a young boy. He came floating toward us with a little upturned face. John Snow Jr., an embalmer aboard the McKay Bennett, told a reporter from the Halifax Herald, after the telegraph cable ship returned to port with more than 200 bodies in late April 1912. Dozens of the dead they found were so disfigured they had to be buried at sea, he said. Unable to identify the toddler, the sailors were so moved that they held a funeral service and buried him in a Halifax cemetery, with a headstone dedicated to the memory of the unknown child. The identity of the boy remained a mystery for nearly a century, until a group of forensic experts gradually pieced it together, using breakthroughs in DNA technology, and the discovery of a pair of tiny shoes, which had been kept by a Halifax police sergeant, tasked with burning all the victims' clothing in 1912. He just couldn't bring himself to destroy what remained of the youngest victim recovered by the sailors. The riddle of the young Titanic victim is recreated in the curious life and death of a new Smithsonian Channel documentary series premiering Sunday. Hosted by award-winning author Lindsay Fitzharris, a London-based historian, the 6-part series examines in painstaking forensic detail the circumstances surrounding the deaths of everyone from Colombian drug lord Pablo Escobar to illusionist Harry Houdini and Rolling Stones musician Brian Jones. The Unknown Child, which airs September 20, is one of the most poignant episodes in the series, said Fitzharris, 38. The story is really moving and continues to fascinate. Scientists began to probe the mystery in the late 1990s, when the Scandinavian descendants of a family who were among the 1,500 victims of the Titanic became convinced they were related to the toddler, according to Fitzharris. In 2002, the remains were exhumed, a 6-inch bone fragment, and 3 teeth were all that was found in the grave. Researchers using the latest available DNA technology at that time seemed to solve the riddle, even though 2 of the young children who perished in the Titanic seemed to share nearly identical mitochondrial DNA, which are passed from mothers to their children through the egg cell. Nevertheless, they concluded that the remains were those of Ino Viljami Panula, who was 13 months old when he died at sea. But the mystery deepened when a Canadian family came forward to donate a pair of brown shoes to Halifax's Maritime Museum of the Atlantic 2 years later. They claimed that the shoes had been taken by their grandfather, Sergeant Clarence Northover of the Halifax Police, who had been in charge of guarding the recovered bodies. Northover kept them in his desk drawer at the police station until he retired. On the bottom of one shoe, he wrote, "Shoes of the only baby found. SS Titanic 1912. The team of researchers went back to the drawing board. For one thing, the shoes were too big for a 13-month-old, and after exhaustive testing, researchers found that the shoes had actually been made in England, not Scandinavia. The shoes likely belonged to a British boy, and thanks to advances in DNA technology, this time scientists were able to make a definitive match. In 2008, the unknown child was finally identified after testing at the U.S. Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory in Maryland. He was Sidney Leslie Goodwin, 19 months old, the youngest son of Frederick and Augusta Goodwin, who had sailed from England with their 6 children to join family in Niagara Falls, New York, and begin a new life. Frederick was set to take a job at a new hydroelectric power station, according to reports. But the family switched ships at the last minute when it became possible for their eldest child, 16-year-old Lillian, to join them on the voyage. They exchanged their second-class tickets on the SS New York for steerage fares on the Titanic. They even hoped the savings would give themselves a faster start when they arrived in America, a descendant told the Toronto Star. All 8 members of the family's 6 children in all perished. The story is heartbreaking, said Fitzharris, who also relates interesting side histories of the Titanic. In the documentary, for instance, when the Titanic first hit the iceberg, the initial news reports said there were no casualties, said Fitzharris, whose lifelong fascination with death stems from the ghost hunting expeditions she took as a child with her grandmother through cemeteries in Chicago. She told the Post, "Wires were literally crossed when the various rescue ships operated the wireless telegraph, a new technology, in 1912. The full horror was only revealed days after the April 15 collision, when reporters were able to interview survivors who had returned to England. It wasn't the fake news of its time, just a lot of crossed signals," Fitzharris said.